Welcome to Momentum for Change, Voices of the Missouri Movement. This is a monthly podcast produced by your coalition, and I am your host, Nora Mosby, a member services specialist at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We hope that you enjoy this conversation coming to you directly from Voices of the Missouri Movement. Some episodes of Momentum for Change have conversations that include content and descriptions of domestic and sexual violence, which may be alarming or activating for some listeners. Please take care and visit the MOCADSV website or call our office to connect with supportive services. Welcome to Season 4 of Momentum for Change. This is your host, Nora Mosby, and Momentum for Change is a podcast brought to you by the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence to lift up voices of the Missouri movement. This is episode 2 of season 4 of the podcast. And in recognition of Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, we are bringing you a discussion focused on youth, advocacy, and empowerment. I am joined today by Kristyn Young, a social worker with a youth and family advocacy program at Legal Services of Eastern Missouri. We're also joined today by Samantha Ghormley Hill, a member services specialist at MOCADSV. Sammy is an attorney, and with this conversation, we're doing something that Legal Services of Eastern Missouri does very well with their services. We are integrating a perspective of legal representation and social work to provide a very comprehensive response to domestic and sexual violence. In this case, to teen dating violence awareness specifically. So I am looking forward to talking to you more about this comprehensive approach to services and cannot wait for our conversation today. So Kristyn and Sammy, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you.
As we're getting started, would you all like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about what you do at the organization you work for?
Yeah.
Chris.
So I am Kristyn. I work at Legal Services of Eastern Missouri with the Youth and Family Advocacy Program. And so I have been here for about 2 years now. But prior to that, I did work for almost 3 years at Russell House, which is a domestic violence shelter in Rolla, Missouri. And so I have a little bit of background in domestic and sexual violence. And so I'm excited to be here and talk about that and kind of join my two passions together. But at Legal Services, our specific program primarily assists youth between the ages of 15 and 19 years old in St. Louis City and County. And so who are unaccompanied, so not living with a parent or legal guardian, and unhoused or at risk of being unhoused. And so we provide both legal representation and social work support. And it can, kind of take different like routes and avenues of what that looks like, which I can kind of, go into more detail as well. But on top of the services that I provide directly to youth, I also do legal outreach clinics where we go to libraries and local youth serving organizations and connect with folks there. And then I also I participate and I'm a support staff for a youth action board with our St. Louis County Continuum of Care as well. And so that's where we work with youth who have lived experience of being homeless, and we kind of talk about any emerging issues and bring that back hopefully to the COC to improve policies and programs.
Wonderful. And Kristyn, I just love that with this conversation, you're really bringing that perspective of providing direct services to young people. But you have a background with supporting survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And so this is really a wonderful perspective to have as we're talking about Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. So I'm so happy you could hop on the podcast.
Yeah, very excited.
Sammy, do you want to go next and tell us about what you do?
Sure. So I'm Samantha Gormley Hill, and I actually the same job title as Nora. We're both member services specialists here at the coalition. As of this month, I've been here for 7 years. And as Nora said, I am actually an attorney. So that's what my background is. I do a lot with legal technical assistance, presentations, our court advocacy roundtable that we have, as well as a lot of just technical assistance, technical assistance and trainings and publications that have to do with things that touch on the legal sphere. I'm really excited about this conversation because one of the things that myself and then Kelly Martinez, who's our legal director, get really excited about finding resources that is kind of like what we see as some black holes where it comes to services or when it comes to populations that can be particularly difficult to either provide services for or to have some like extra complexities when it comes to providing services. And so usually those can kind of be addressed by things within the legal realm, which is what we're really excited about. And so we're really excited about having this particular conversation about working with this population.
And we are going to get to some of those complexities in just a minute. But before we do, Kristen, I did want to ask a little bit more about the Youth and Family Advocacy Program at Legal Services. So you're working primarily with young people. How do they connect with your services? How are they finding out about legal services?
Yeah. So, for our specific program, we have some unique avenues that you can get in touch with us. Generally, for most folks, they go through our main line and get in contact with our art or advocacy referral team. And so, for our specific program, though, we actually have our own intake coordinator. So we have a few ways. We get partner referrals all the time from schools, youth serving organizations. We also, through our outreach legal clinics, we also have clients that get in contact with us directly through those. And then we also have a online referral form. So we use that a lot. And it is a QR code that we put on all of our business cards. So we have a program specific business card so that anyone can scan that. And we really encourage youth to directly reach out to us. Of course, if they have a case manager or a supportive adult who wants to, or they ask that adult to reach out, that's totally fine. But for our specific purposes, since we're directly representing the youth, we always have to talk to the youth directly. And so we really encourage youth to fill that out. And then our intake coordinator will follow up with them and hopefully set up an intake if they qualify for our services. So we really try to be as available as possible because we know, especially for young people, it can be really scary to reach out for the first time. It might be the first time that they've had to enter services. A lot of times, it's the first time that they've been homeless in their life. So we know that can be kind of scary. So that's why we like the referral form because it's not as intense as a phone call. And then we can, reach out to them through whatever means, email, text, call, whatever they need.
Is there ever an element of kind of peer referral where one teen will have a really good experience and tell a friend or tell another young person about the services and get connected with you all that way?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, we'll have past clients call me and say, "Hey, I have a friend going through this. What can they do?" And then I get in contact with them. Also, the youth action board that I'm a part of, I've talked to them about all of our services, and they are great advocates for other youth in the community. They really are passionate about making sure other folks are aware of the effective services they can get in contact with. So I also work a lot with them, and they'll come to me and say, "Hey, I have someone living here and what can they do," and then hopefully get them into services. And since we only go up to 19, if they're older youth, we have a lot of programs that we always try to like triage and get them connected to them as well.
And what are some of the common issues that young people are coming to legal services wanting assistance with? What are some common things that you can help out with?
Yeah, so a lot of young folks who don't have like a parent or legal guardian in their life face a variety of issues. So one in particular is always housing. Couch surfing, being doubled up in other people's homes is super common. It's actually what, in my opinion, in my experience, one of the most common ways that youth present as homeless. And so access to housing, getting them connected to youth housing programs like transitional or independent living programs is always a really priority issue that we see coming through those referrals. And then access to public benefits. So even youth who are under the age of 18, depending on their situation, being a qualified minor, which I know we'll kind of get into later as well, getting them connected to health insurance through Medicaid, getting them on SNAP. If they have a child, we'll do childcare subsidy, WIC, TANF, because that will give them those resources directly to youth. And then identification is another huge one. I do so much of that. I do, IDs, birth certificates, social security cards. We also can help. We're kind of unique because we get different funding. So our type of funding allows us to do municipal court tickets. So we can do a lot of traffic tickets, any stealing charges, things like that that are going to be in the municipal court. We can represent them on as well. And we see a lot of those. A lot of youth will get a car, but they may not have it titled or registered, and haven't had anyone sit down and talk to them about what that means. And so I've done a lot of that with folks as well. And then in my role as the social worker, I feel like the way I always describe it is just they are hitting so many life milestones without a trusted adult to talk to. And so I'm really trying to be a problem solver and someone who can just talk through the issue and give them their options so that they can know the best route to go to address those issues.
So it's really not just one isolated issue, it's a full range of issues that young people might be working with. You talked about going to court for municipal tickets, getting an ID, getting housing, a full range of options. Um, and you're really hitting at something that you've mentioned a little bit already, which is providing comprehensive services. Kristyn, when you were an advocate at Russell House, you participated in the MOCADSV Sexual Assault Services Enhancement Collaborative, which was really focused on capacity building for sexual assault services. And one of those ways to build capacity was by providing comprehensive services to survivors of sexual assault, looking at the totality of issues that a survivor might need support around and meeting survivors where those needs exist. Sammy, I know you also have a real passion for moving from core services to comprehensive services. Can you all talk a little bit about moving to comprehensive services and the impact that it has on young people in particular?
Yeah, you want to go or I can go?
You go first,
Cool,
Kristen.
yeah. And so one thing too that came to mind that I should point out about our program that's unique at Legal Services is we're a generalist program. So a lot of our programs are focused specifically on a type of law, like housing, public benefits. But because we recognize that there are so many issues that a young person may be coming to legal services for, we really try to encompass everything that may pop up for them. And so at Legal Services, we typically use the word holistic advocacy and so or a holistic representation. And so way that we interpret that is giving them the legal representation and hopefully covering any legal issues so that they won't need an attorney, ideally in the future, or at least in the near future. And then we also then provide the social work support for myself. And so through that we have several ways that we kind of have increased our ability to support folks. One really cool thing we have at Legal Services, two things, is we can provide cab transportation to folks addressing transportation because transportation is an essential service. But the city of St. Louis and the county does not have great public transportation. It's not the best, and so we really try to help utilize that because that's usually one of the largest barriers we see folks experiencing. And then we also have what we call the social work closet. So if someone's a client, we have a whole slew of cleaning products, hygiene products, household items, diapers, cribs that we can just go and grab whenever we want. And so we really try to not only just address whatever legal matters we're assisting them with, but also say, well, do you have enough to eat? Do you have transportation to this appointment? Do you have hygiene products? For young folks, I've found that hygiene products are really important because you're going to school and you don't have, shampoo, conditioner, body wash, deodorant. You're around peers and that can be really intimidating and you don't want to stand out. You want to be able to participate in school and have those access to those things. And so we've really worked to empower them and help them problem solve and address any issue that comes up. We hardly ever say no, we can't help you with that. And so for this type of holistic representation and support, we're really looking at go back in social work terms, person and environment and what ways and what barriers in the system are they experiencing, and then how can we follow up and make sure that they'll be successful in the future and really try to build those resiliency and that empowerment so that they feel empowered to go and do it on their own. Example I'll give that I always love that's really exciting is a lot of times when I have a young person, they're really scared to make a phone call to a doctor's office or to make an appointment, and I'll start doing that with them at the beginning, and then eventually I'll kind of say, why don't you try on your own? And then before I know it, they're not even asking me for that assistance. They're just like, oh yeah, I called and make this appointment. Can you help me with transportation now? I'm like, of course. And so that's really exciting. It sounds silly and maybe a small win, but it's huge for youth who are doing these things on their own for the first time. So yeah, we really try to look at all of the aspects of what they may be experiencing and then hopefully prevent some things from happening in the future and then get them in a better place when they leave our services.
That makes so much sense because we don't always think of deodorant or a cab ride or even a phone call as really the transformative services that we know young people might need. But the reality is that it can overcome some barriers that they are facing and added up all together can create these holistic services that truly can and do make a huge difference in young people's lives.
Yeah.
Sammy, anything you want to say about comprehensive services?
I mean, so the thing that I love about that, and the thing that I love about legal services is doing is that for years now, there's been that larger conversation in the legal community about providing trauma informed representation and how much of that is you have to, much like in survivor center advocacy, you got to meet your client, you have to meet the person where they're at. And if I'm a client and I'm spending that entire meeting being freaked out because I think I smell, I'm not going to be as participatory in addressing what it is that my attorney thinks that we need to be focused on. So if my attorney is like, "You need to get this order of protection. I want you to walk me through what happened here," and I'm spending the entire time thinking, "I haven't showered in 3 or 4 days." Like I will. There's enough of my brain that is going to be focused on that I'm not actually going to be responding to you in a way that's perhaps going to be the most helpful for you in representing me. And that is a common like frustration that I've heard voiced from attorneys. They're like, that's not the most important thing. The important thing is that, you have this, that you've had this ticket address, that you have this order of protection, that you're making strides in your divorce. And they're like, okay, but for them personally in that space, they can't think about that thing. It's like the fly that's like right in front of your face. Like you can't pay attention to anything else in the room until there's not that buzzing. Um, and so I think that it's such a great way to build rapport and comfort. And I love it. And it's really where it goes hand in hand with so many of the philosophies behind what we do. In the domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy field, which is meeting this person where they're at and providing those comprehensive um, resources and connections in order for people to feel like they're in a really good space to start their lives. And I feel like the thing that's really cool about both of these programs is in a way they're both about like renewal in a way that's really beautiful and like kind of taking wherever you come in with and whatever you come up with and like let's help you figure out in a place so that you can live here and feel good about where you're going and feel like you're kind of on steadier ground, which is hopefully how people are feeling after they leave from getting services from one of the programs that provide domestic and sexual violence advocacy in the state and also from legal services as well. So I think it's just I love it so much.
Yeah, my approach to advocacy is really about celebrating successes, no matter how large or small. And so I think it's important after a day of work to say, you know what? We won this legal court case and I got somebody connected with some deodorant. Like, what a great day.
Mhm.
I will tell you, as a mom of 2 small children, having a shower sometimes feels like a really big success of a day.
100%.
So, like,
100%.
it all matters, it all counts.
So we're talking about working with teens specifically this month because February is Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. This is an issue that you both have a lot of experience with and thoughts on to talk about, but I love starting with an origin story. So can you tell me a little bit about where your passion for working with youth comes from?
Yeah, I go. So I knew in grad school that I kind of want to work with youth. So both of my practicums when I was getting my master's in social work were both at youth serving organizations. And so, but at the same time, I was also having a concentration in violence and injury prevention. So I've kind of always had this like merge of these two passions. And so I feel like too when I've worked with young people and when I work with young people in this capacity, it is I don't feel like inspiring is the right word, but it's really encouraging to see. Feel like youth are really open to asking for help and being honest and open about what their struggle is and what they're going through. But also there's a lot of privilege that I feel where they are willing to share what's going on, because it's not the same for every person that they may encounter. And we really try to build that rapport from the beginning and just say, like, if there's anything you don't want to tell us, then you don't have to. And I feel like, they take that, and then, sure enough, like a week or two later, they'll reach out and tell me a bit more. And then we always meet them with non-judgment and like acceptance. And so I just really feel like working with young people is really, really fulfilling, and they're so innovative too. Sometimes they will come to me and be like, "I've had this issue. Here's X, Y, and Z of what I've done." I'm like, "Oh, I actually wouldn't have even thought of trying those ways." And so that's awesome that you've like done this. And they also are like, sometimes I think there's a misconception about youth who are unhoused or struggling to be unhoused, that they just like don't care about school, or that they don't really have that many goals. But that's just not true in my
Yeah.
experience. And so they're like, "Oh, I really want to finish school and I want to go to college, and what can I do?" And so it's really neat to be able to like workshop those goals together. And then they're always like so proud of when we accomplish that. And so it's just really encouraging to see, and like all of their like hopes and dreams, like it's a privilege to be able to hear those and then help them, hopefully fulfill those, and move on to go get school, or go get schooling, or go to a trade school, or just get a good job. And so it's always great to be able to work with them in that capacity.
Yeah, there's so much that, of course, that we can do to support young people, so much we can teach young people about the world. But one of those silver linings of advocacy is that there's so much that we can learn from young people, and that innovation, I can see how fulfilling that would be. Sammy, do you want to add anything to that?
Um, I mean, I have to say that probably my really strong feelings when it comes to like providing advocacy and resources for teens definitely came from being a teenager myself, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. Like I definitely, and it for me, I feel like where it really rooted was in issues of things like comprehensive sex education. Like I remember having conversation as a teenager with kids, and they're like telling me how they learned, and it was like my peers are telling me, "Oh, I learned about sex from the person who's trying to have sex with me." And I'm like, maybe this isn't the best way to get information. And I remember like sitting there with like groups of kids like before like track and field practice, and we're like, "So is this sex, or does this count as sex, or what is this here?" And I just remember like I'm like, these are not like the ways we should be getting information. And I'm definitely dating myself because like people did not you didn't have your phone at the time to like look up things. So that was like a whole different um it's a whole different situation that for good and bad that's gonna go there. But like it was mostly like it was like you crowdfunded from like people that you went to classes with, your peers, your their older siblings, like people you worked with as a teenager. And I just remember thinking at the time like how exploitable that system is.
Mhm.
Because if you're not getting information from anybody that you trust as an authority figure, that you have an inbuilt like rapport and trust built up with, that doesn't mean you're not getting any information. It just means that like you're probably not getting very reliable information, because the person who's giving you that information is giving it to you for a purpose. So,
Mhm.
and it's usually they're trying to get you to do something or be okay with something or to go along with something. I and the things that happen at that point in time in your life, like they become very deeply embedded into who you are as a person and who you will continue to be as a person going forward. Um, and I feel like when we leave those like black holes of information and services, it's really a huge failure on our part. And it's an age group, especially with teenagers, that we're so inconsistent about. You're
Mhm.
a child, but we expect you to receive things like you're an adult, and your maturity should be like you're an adult, but you have to do what we tell you because you're so young. And so it's just there's so many inconsistent messagings, and even like within the law, there's so many inconsistent laws about what you can do, what you can't do, what you can be accountable for, what you can't, and it's impossible to navigate without some really um, good assistance and services and education. And so like I'm so excited
Mhm.
about Kristen being here and the information that they do, because that comprehensive services is really how you're going to be able to help set up people to maybe have less things to talk about with their therapists in their 30s, like to be in a situation where, they get to feel a little more confident and comfortable taking on the world at a younger age.
Yeah. And one thing, Sammy, that you said that I wanted to bring it up too is, you talk about sex education and making sure that they have access to that information. And so, one of the most common healthcare appointment requests that I get is for STI checks and tests, for, reproductive health services. And that was kind of surprising for me whenever I first started in this position. And so, one of my like routine practices is when we do an intake is say, if you ever have any reproductive health or any interest in doing an STI check or going to see a doctor about reproductive or sexual health, then let me know and talk to me about that, and we can get that set up. And now, just opening that door and letting them know that that's available, I have so many people then reach out to me and say, actually, can you help me get access to these services, which is great.
And I believe it because there's such a strong thirst for teenagers when it comes to new information because they want to feel independent. They want to make choices that they can feel good about and that's going to like kind of carry them further in their lives. And so um, it doesn't surprise me that there's so many that are just extremely thoughtful in that way. And they're like, I do want this information because I want to be healthier. I want to be, because they're working on independence, being a grown up, and all
And
those
it's so
things we tell
interesting
them.
to me that when you let them know that these services are available and reproductive health care is something that you can help out with, it's something that they take you up on. Whereas if you didn't let them know that, maybe they wouldn't know it was an option that you could help out with.
Yeah, I just don't think, yeah, there are a lot of adults bringing that up to them. And, a lot of it's in a school setting where, teacher or counselor or therapist are there, a school social worker may not just, have the ability to say those things. And so I always
Right.
just try to make sure, yeah, it's an open door. And so, even if maybe they don't ask for services right away, we try to cover as much as possible. So they always have that in the back of their head that they can always reach out.
Yeah. So you mentioned that sometimes there are missed opportunities for connecting and providing services to young people. And sometimes that's just because we don't understand what young people need. Is there anything else you want to say about what we should understand about young people and what they need and what would be helpful?
Yeah. So one thing too I wanted to talk about like in this topic is a lot of the research and the way that we try to center our program around youth is we try to really be aware of adultism. And so you
Oh,
might have like heard the clicking around because I wanted to pull up my definition for it. Because my program is actually workshopped a definition. I don't think very many people think about adultism when working with youth. And so what we kind of go by and define that as is the use of power and privilege held by adults that denies youth access to their autonomy and decision making abilities. It can both be individual or systemic and exists across a spectrum from small remarks to larger misuses of power. And
okay.
so, within that definition, we're really trying to hit home that youth are treated differently. There's no denying that. And they should not be denied their ability to have, have a say in their decisions and what happens. I think a lot of that's stripped away in the various systems that they interact in. And so we always try to be aware of sometimes, we'll go into each other's offices and be like, I'm kind of feeling frustrated about this thing, but like, should I be, this is their choice. And we check ourselves a lot and say, okay, actually don't think this is a big deal. They've made the decision. It may not be my decision, but that's okay. And so, and it's coming from that place of non-judgment, that self-determination for clients so that they
Well,
always know, I'll say, pros and cons of situations, but I say no matter what you choose, if something goes wrong or something goes right, I'll still be here to support you. And something else I've learned that I fully believe in when working with youth is they want a professional, not a friend. And I think there is a inclination for people working with young people, especially when they are not, they don't have a parent or legal guardian and maybe they're housing unstable, that, you want to step in as like a friend or a parent and have like a more informal relationship. But they want a professional. They want someone who's
yeah.
going to call them back when you say, who's going to like follow up on resources and who's going to like, treat them as like a respected individual. And so I see, a lot of youth come to me and sometimes have negative experiences out in the community. And so I always don't want to be that roadblock, that barrier. So I really encourage folks to don't see them as children, like we've talked about, like they are their own individuals, they are reaching adulthood, and they are capable of making informed decisions. And even if it's not what you would do, we all made mistakes as a young person, and we seem to forget that as we get older, and that's okay if not everything is work out perfect and fine, as long as ultimately they're safe. You should always allow them to focus on what they think is best for them, and then support them regardless of the outcome. Um, I've sometimes had calls and things like that where they say, oh, I can't believe they're still hanging out with so and so, or they get really personal about it, which I understand because we're really invested in the people that we work with. But at the end of the day, I always try to hold that boundary and say, I'm here as a professional for you. I am not going to tell you, what to do, but I'll give you information so you can make a good decision.
Those are two such important points, I think, for service providers to consider is that you're in a position of privilege as an adult. And so to kind of recognize how that impacts services. But I also love what you said about young people want a professional and not a friend, because I think those boundaries can get blurry, especially when you're working with young people. But that is just really, really important to hear. So I'm glad you spoke to that. Sammy, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, the boundaries thing, I love that for a multitude of reasons that my brain's going in like 7 different directions on, so I'm gonna try to
Those were some
corral
really good
to
points.
theirs
That's
because I'm
good.
like because it is like everything you're saying, it's also fantastic because, um, it's so one to one in many ways to our work, and not that every survivor we work with is a teenager, or not even in a way of like, it's like, but like they're respect as a human being, as somebody who is coming from a space where they're going to be making major changes in their life, and uh, what they want is respect, and they want boundaries, and they want to be able to navigate themselves having boundaries and respect, and know that they can be treated seriously. And I feel like, for someone who is young, and also for somebody who's been a victim, and is a survivor of something incredibly traumatic, just having both boundaries and respect, I feel like goes such a huge way towards feeling like you're a person and that you matter in yourself, like as an integrated self, and not just this person, this one thing has happened to this once, or somebody who just happens to be of an age for whatever, that is seen as something. And so I love that idea that by doing what you're talking about, which is essentially also survivor centered advocacy, which is such a cornerstone of our work. When you see them as a whole person and you do those boundaries and you do respect, like that's going to get you farther. Because ultimately, that's what everybody wants is to feel like a whole integrated person that matters.
I
Um,
agree.
Yeah. And one more thing too, I'll add is one of the things our program does is we always, when we're doing an intake and they're signing retainer, we explicitly explain to them how they can make a grievance. If they're not happy with how we're treating them, how our services are going, we really believe in the grievance process, because we
Okay.
think that young people and clients in general, and this might just be the legal aid, part of us, but we really, really believe that they should be fully informed on their grievance process, because they also have rights to file that and to talk to us and say, I don't appreciate this treatment, and then we always want that feedback if that is happening. And then another thing too to add is I really, really like feel like this came from me working in like the survivor space with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Is I've always believed that me yelling at a client and getting upset is so different than a client getting upset and yelling at me, because like you said, like we have a position of power and privilege. I can end services with a client at any time, and they don't have that luxury. I mean, they can fire me, which is totally fine too. But they need things from me, and so having that position of power and privilege is just something we try to be aware of, and make sure that we're never taking advantage of that too as adults, working with young people.
well, the thing that I love also is what you're talking about essentially there is the two part. Like, one, it's so incredibly important to be aware that the power dynamics between you and the person you're working with are so incredibly skewed. Like, You were the one with the information and the access and the everything else, and they're just trying to come and get that from you, and they might feel the need of, "I have to play along, I have to placate you in order for me to get access to these things that I need." Um, and there's so much inherent responsibility to go along with that. Uh, but that being said, you're not a robot, you're a person. And so, like, as somebody who's providing those services, and I feel like these are internal conversations that within this work we have all the time. Like, how to do in order to be able to do truly survivor centered work, you're like, how do I on the back end make sure that I'm not bringing my stuff into the room in a way that's going to affect this other person so much. So having to build in, as you said, going to talk to your coworkers, going to talk into having those internal processes of being like, I'm allowed to have feelings and processes through this, but I'm not allowed to make them this other person's responsibility. And just like I feel like that understanding of power dynamics is so important for um, you also as somebody who's modeling to people who are at a younger age where they're going into workspaces and they're going into housing situations and all sorts of things that they're going to be continuing to interact with such inequitable power dynamics, like that understanding that they can have that expectation of
Yeah.
autonomy in space.
Those power dynamics are so important to be aware of as a service provider. But I want to get into some of the other dynamics that you're seeing when you're working with young people. So you're largely working with young people who are either experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. Now, in the domestic and sexual violence advocacy world, oftentimes it's experiences related directly to the violence that can cause someone to lose their stable housing. What kinds of situations or experiences are you seeing with the young people you work with that are causing them to lose their safe and stable housing?
Yeah, yeah. So, um, part of what we're seeing is, violence or abuse from a family member, from a partner. That is one that do see pretty frequent. We do see a lot of clients that have a difficult relationship with their family that they stay with. And, I hear a lot, I had to leave for my own mental health. It just was
Mhm.
not healthy for me to be in that situation. And so, we do see some violence and abuse. A lot of times, if it is severe enough, usually Children's Division has stepped in at some point. So we don't work with folks who are under the jurisdiction of Children's Division. So we don't see those severe cases as much, but occasionally we will get someone who, was able to leave safely and then is now staying with, friend, family member, or something like that. Another one we see a lot is just sometimes this conflict then results in a parent or family member kicking the youth out.
Mhm.
And a lot of that can happen, Again, another misconception I think is that people think that if a youth is homeless, it's something that they've done. But a lot of times it's something that was out of their control. They weren't able to have a say in whether or not they were able to stay in that home. And so we just see a lot of family conflict as well. And sometimes it's this like yo yo effect in a way where a parent will put them out and then they'll be like, fine, I'll leave. I'll go stay here. And then a few days later, maybe the parent has like calmed down, cooled off a little bit, and then they request the youth to come back. The youth is like, well, you kicked me out. But then the parent will threaten to call the police and threaten to say they're a runaway. So we see
Right.
that a lot too, which is sometimes difficult to navigate because their parental rights are still intact, and so they can do that. And so that's a fear that we see with a lot of young people as well. And then, one of the most common situations we see though is just the passing of a parent. They maybe had
Oh,
a parent in their life and then they passed. And then, now they're trying to figure out who they're going to live with. Sometimes they can live with extended family they barely know. And
okay.
so that is a huge part of what we see a lot, which is, sad because then now they're going through not only homelessness, but grief and
Mhm.
loss. And that it can be really difficult to process. Um, and then it's just, unfortunately, again, I think this kind of goes back to adultism. We see a lot of exploitation from adults, and we just kind of assume that if they're a family member or they're supporting this young person, then they have the best intentions, which fortunately is not always true.
Mhm.
And we see something that is an emerging trend that we're really concerned about is financial abuse. So, an
Mm.
example I can give is we have a client previously who had a loan taken out in their name when they were 14 by their mom. And things like that, to where we always do credit reports now as much as we can with new clients. And the amount of stuff we've seen on those where they're like, I was 10 years old. Like, how is that on my credit? And it's already
Yeah.
ruining that like financial wellness for them in the future. So, um, unfortunately, a lot of the exploitation from adults in their life happens. Sometimes folks will be on a SNAP case for a household, but hasn't lived in that household for over a year. So we just see a lot of those situations pop up, which is not surprising, but disappointing sometimes when we're like, you're an adult, you're supposed to be here to protect young people, but doesn't always
Right.
happen, unfortunately, that way.
So in those scenarios, I can see how there's such an opportunity for service providers to make a big difference. But sometimes um, I think there's a reluctance for service providers to serve young people, specifically maybe who are 16 and 17 years old. But in Missouri, we do have a qualified minor law. And this is a tool in our advocacy toolbox that we could take out to meet those needs as they arise. So, can you tell us about the qualified minor law and kind of how you use it as a tool in your toolbox?
Yeah, so I have like my notes typed up, so I'm gonna look at those. And disclaimer, I'm not an attorney, but this is like pulled from the statute in our notes. But
Yeah.
so Missouri has no path to legal emancipation. I think that's also something that not very many people know. And so, and what Missouri has instead is the qualified minor law. And so there are very specific criteria that a young person has to meet to be able to be considered a qualified minor. So the first is always going to be they're 16 or 17 years old, and so if they're 15, unfortunately, they will not count. They have to wait till they're 16, and then they have to be homeless or survivor of domestic violence. And the way that we define homeless is lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So that, kind of is a broad definition. Again, like the majority of youth homelessness that we see is being doubled up or couch surfing. And then the next criteria is they have to be self supporting. So essentially, they are not receiving some sort of like financial support, social support, emotional support from a parent or legal guardian. And then the last kind of category, which is sometimes the hardest to discern, is they have to be living with the consent of a parent or legal guardian. So that consent can be implied or express consent. So usually that's kind of the trickiest part is,
It will.
if a parent is still in contact with them, it's kind of sometimes a judgment call, case by case basis of if they meet that criteria.
Mhm.
And then it does not apply to youth who are under the supervision of Children's Division or the jurisdiction of the Juvenile Justice Court.
Mhm.
So those, unfortunately, they have guardians usually in place through that, or some sort of custody in place in those situations to where they would not be able to be considered a qualified minor. And then what the qualified minor, though, law allows them to do is contract for services. So
Yeah.
they are able to contract for things like housing, create a bank account, obtain medical and mental health care. So they actually like changed this not too long ago to specifically state mental health as a service that they could access, which is really, a huge part of what we do. They can also count it does admission to shelter and crisis services for survivors of domestic violence, and then it's admission to high school or secondary school and employment. So it's a really cool law. I think that there's always pros and cons. I think the pro of it is you don't have to go to court. You don't have to face your parents in court, which can be
Mhm.
really intimidating, which some states do, require that they do, or, prove that you make enough money that you can support yourself. And so we don't have some of those things, which is good. And then one of the things that our program does a lot is verifying that status. So we typically will provide what we call a qualified minor letter. Our attorney who represents them will do those,
Interesting.
and then specifically state what service they're able to contract for. But it doesn't have to be an attorney. I actually pulled this from the statute today. It can be a director designee of a governmental or nonprofit agency that receives public or private funding to provide services to homeless persons, a local education agency liaison for homeless children and youth,
Then we'll
or a licensed attorney representing the youth in that matter. So it doesn't have to be an attorney, but So it can be really like a flexible tool for organizations to use so that they can contract for youth whenever they may come to their services.
I think that's such a wonderful service to be able to provide that documentation that states that someone is a qualified minor. However, does someone need to have a letter stating they're a qualified minor in order to get services such as from a domestic violence shelter or a sexual violence advocacy program or shelter?
Yeah, no, yeah, a letter is not required. It's just something we have found, especially since we're doing a lot of access to healthcare. I
Okay.
know, one of the examples I use is I attended an orthodontics appointment with a client, and then I contacted the attorney because they were kind of, questioning, like, can we see this young person? And then that attorney sent that letter along. So sometimes it just gives you a little bit more like oomph to and make people feel better about being able to serve that young person, but it's not a requirement. And I really encourage agencies if they are seeing qualified minors pop up a lot to have some sort of internal process because it can just be a checklist of do they meet this criteria, but they do not have to have any certain type of paperwork. It's just something we found to be helpful when they are accessing those services.
Great. So if a young person meets all of those criteria, they would be able to come to shelter even if they don't have a parent with them.
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Sammy, anything you want to say about qualified minors or the law here?
Well, I feel like she did a very good job of covering it. I think one of the things that is important to kind of for our particular work. So just a couple of things to add in there. One of the things she talked about was the um, requirement of sorry, my brain is working faster than my eyes are working. That the minor's parent or legal guardian has consented to the minor living independent of their control. Um, that's something that can be either expressed or implied consent. So express consent means specifically like there was like a verbal or written statement like you have to leave this house. You're kicked out. You can't be here. But the thing that does, and I feel like that comes up more frequently for us when it comes to our programs are calling and they're like, does this person count as qualified minor? Is that implied consent? And by law, that implied consent is that any action made by the parent or the guardian that indicates the parent or the guardian is unwilling or unable to adequately care for them. And that includes barring them from the home or otherwise indicating that they're not welcome, refusing to provide financial support for the minor, um, or abusing or neglecting the minor, or committing an
Mhm.
act of domestic violence against the minor. So that is an aspect that is required in order to be called a qualified minor because that is a question we get sometimes as they come in, and if they are just a survivor of teen dating violence or sexual assault and their parent aren't the ones that committed that and their parent is still or guardian is still active in their lives, they don't count as a qualified minor.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that your program can't provide them services though, which I feel like is the automatic assumption is I can only provide services if somebody is a qualified minor. You can provide services to that person, but um, as long as the parents are okay with you providing services with that person, just like any other doctor or a therapist or anything else. So, like, you can still provide services to people. You just can't do it under the qualified minor statute. That's a
Okay.
totally different thing. The other thing that's important um, when it comes to qualified minors and when it comes to working with all minors that I think, and that is the conversation about confidentiality and mandated reporting. Um, Confidentiality applies to youth. It applies to teenagers the exact same way that it applies to adults.
Sure.
Now, if somebody is a mandated reporter, if somebody is under the age of 18 or younger, um, they do still count under that mandated reporting law, which means
Mhm.
even though somebody is a qualified minor, that is someone that, according to the law, is someone that hotline can be made about by somebody who is a mandated reporter. So, if we're talking about survivor centered practices, we're talking about best practices of working with a qualified minor or working with a minor. Um, your program has a responsibility
Mhm.
of being very clear up front whether or not the person that they are directly working with is someone who is a mandated reporter, what that means, and
Sure.
offering them an ability to work with somebody who isn't.
Mhm.
Because when we're talking about those boundaries and that respect and that autonomy, especially somebody who is dealing with something who's coming to our program, which means they have some sort of hugely traumatic event, most likely by somebody that they're close to, and that there was a level of trust in. You cannot build trust with someone unless you're very clear in your parameters from the beginning. I am a mandated reporter. This is what it means to be a mandated reporter. This is how it can affect the services that I can provide to you. This person is not a mandated reporter. This is what they can do, and this is what they can't do. And you can choose, because there are some people, and this is what I think it's important to emphasize. There are some people who love and want to talk to a mandated reporter because something has happened to them that they believe will be more believable
Mhm.
coming from someone else. They might feel it's more likely that you're going to be believed if it is a counselor, if it is a social worker who is calling and talking to Children's Division and letting them know that something has occurred. And that might make them feel more like they're going to be believed and understood. There are other people who they're not wanting to go that route because they're just trying to figure out what's happening with them. They might be like, I don't know if this is something you would have to report, but I already feel in so little control of so many things in my life that I want to feel more in control of what's happening and be able to feel autonomous and making decisions, especially since my trust has been so grievously violated, that I want support in doing that. And I want it from someone that I know has to follow that confidentiality law and doesn't have an exception that's built in for that mandated reporting. And so, in order to provide services to youth in a way that is survivor centered and is following all the laws, because is to have those kind of best practices where you're very clear from the beginning and you're also giving them options in order when they're receiving services from you and letting them know what that means. I think that's what
Well,
I.
you all well, I was to say too, so something that you said made me think too. So, with that like implied consent or express consent, we also see a lot where a parent is just going through their own things. They have a lot of challenges and barriers as well, and they just may not be able to provide a stable home at that time. And so the youth may be living at a friend's partner's place, whatever, and the parents totally okay with it. They have consented to it, but well, our program always tries to do too is say, okay, what's your relationship like with them? Do you feel safe with them? Do you have good communication, a good relationship? And instead of going through, because it is an arduous process to get places to agree to see a youth, even if they are a qualified minor, we'll say, okay, well, will mom or dad go to this appointment with you? Are you comfortable with that? Are there any problems you see? So we always try to like maintain the family unit as well, because I think that's like an important part. We don't want to like hurt family relationships by going around them.
Oh my God.
So I think that's like also important. Involve the parent if you can, if it's safe to do this. So
Yeah, and also, like, it's just I feel like just even that acknowledgement that they're navigating incredibly complicated situations, and that a lot of these services are not easy to navigate under the best of circumstances. So if you're
Mhm.
an adult with a zero trauma that has ever happened to you, these systems are incredibly complicated and difficult to navigate. When we add in factors like you're a survivor of some sort of trauma, be it a sexual assault, domestic violence, anything that it could have been, or you're someone who is de facto homeless for a variety of circumstances um, that becomes harder.
yeah.
So many important points you all raised around qualified minors. And I just encourage listeners, if you have questions that come up about providing services to 16 and 17-year-olds, or if somebody is a qualified minor or not, please give us a call at the coalition. We're clearly always very happy to talk about qualified
Yep.
minors and issues surrounding the law. So, speaking of the law, one of our mantras here at MOCADSV is we change laws, we change lives. And so we are in the midst, it's February, and we are in the midst of the legislative session here at the state level. And one priority bill that we've had some movement on, we've actually had a hearing already this session, is around raising the marriage age to 18. It's Senate Bill 66. And we have seen research and evidence that the younger person gets married at around 16 or 17, the higher risk of violence that they are um, that they could experience. There was a 2023 study from the National Institute of Health that actually found that people who are 15 faced 3 times the amount of experiencing intimate partner violence than people who got married at an older age. So I was wondering if you could speak to this effort to raise the marriage age to 18 and just provide a little bit of background and information.
Um, I could do a little bit. So yeah, actually, Matthew Huffman, who's our chief public affairs officer here at the coalition, went and gave testimony in support of this bill, which is not. The thing that I find so fascinating about it is unless you've had cause to directly think about it, I think there's a lot of assumption that you can't get married unless you're 18. Um, and the fact that there has been historically uh, a lot of blowback about this concept of only people who are 18 and above being able to be married. And it actually wasn't until 2018. So much of this is so recent. I think that's the thing that's always so wild to me when it comes to doing this work is how new so much of it is when we're talking legislatively. Um, so it wasn't until 2018 that the General Assembly raised the minimum age of marriage here in Missouri to from 15 to 16 with a parent's written permission. Um, but those exceptions are without exception, because as we were talking about that very complicated space that teenagers are in. So we're talking about 16 to 17. That age was the same thing as the qualified minors, where there's all of those things that are already incredibly difficult for them to access service wise, that are for them to able to contract for, to do all of that. If you add in the fact that they might be married, which was signed off by a parent, to somebody who could be abusive, to somebody who has an it can't be an equitable marriage by the way that the world and the law will treat that person. Like, they won't have as many avenues to feel that they can comfortably get out in order to feel like they have. So you're not talking about necessarily what is de facto a marriage of equals or a partnership of equals. Because you have that limited protections in the law and the amount of barriers that we've covered in this conversation. Um, Even if you are emancipated. And so it can be incredibly difficult path for safety. And so just by raising that year you to 18, you're increasing the amount of safety and access for people who are making these steps to make sure that people who are getting married in a situation that is an equitable relationship for both parties in it, where both parties choose to stay
Mhm.
but could leave if the circumstances were created for them to do so. And yeah, I mean, it's just, yeah, because it was talking about the data from the Department of Health and Senior Services that between 2019 and 2021, roughly 230 minors were married here in Missouri, and about
Mhm.
75% of those were girls under the age of 18.
Well,
So, and as Matthew said, if we have the standard of adulthood that you have to be 18 to join the military, you have to be 18 to vote, you have to be 18 to do these very adult seeming tasks, what we have decided are very adult tasks, then having that standard for marriage is just goes in line with philosophies that we've already had put in place.
well, hopefully a lot more to come on the issue of raising the marriage age here in Missouri, but we have seen some positive attention in the Missouri General Assembly this session on that issue. We are almost out of time, you all, but I did want to just ask a final question about schools. When it comes to working with youth and working with even efforts to prevent or address teen dating violence, often that's happening in schools. So, can you all speak a little bit about working with schools and what works when you're collaborating with schools?
Yeah, so a lot of my work in schools, I'm doing a lot of like school enrollment typically. That's usually where my kind of services start, and then, supporting them once they are enrolled. And what I have found success in is always figuring out what, the districts or the individual school, if they have, which they should, a McKinney-Vento homeless liaison. And so, since most of my folks are in house or housing unstable, those homeless liaisons are really going to be like the experts. They should be the ones that understand, the McKinney-Vento law, being able to have immediate enrollment. And what it really helps the youth that I work with is that immediate enrollment is going to get them in the school environment, going to open up the immediate services that they can receive from the school. And then on the back end, okay, we're working to get their past educational records. We're working on getting their vaccine records. Those things that schools do need, but it's not going to be a barrier, or it's not going to cause them to have a delay in enrollment. So really, a lot of our focus with schools is making sure that youth are immediately enrolled, so they have as little a gap as possible between when they're getting their education. And so I have pretty good rapport with quite a few McKinney-Vento liaisons throughout St. Louis City and county. And so that is usually my entry point when I'm working with youth. And then from there, do they need an IEP? Do they need extra support, like services? What do they need in that school? And we have a program at Legal Services that specializes in IEPs. So if that comes up, it's great. We can just refer them right over to our Children's Legal Alliance. And so that for me has been, successful with like developing those specific relationships. And then, I've been working more on getting connected to more school social workers. But since those homeless liaisons are kind of the first line that I interact with, I have focus on like really building up those relationships. So I have always a great contact to reach out to whenever I need to.
Remember those social workers and the homeless services liaisons. They are a great connection to have, that's for sure.
Yes.
Well, as we're wrapping up this episode, I just love so much of the content that we have covered today. You will have really touched on some important issues. Any final thoughts you wanted to be sure to speak to before we wrap up this episode?
I think the last thing I'll touch on that I was thinking about during this is specifically around teen dating violence is it presents really different sometimes from adults. And so I have a lot of youth who have a lot of online concerns, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. Find My Friends is everywhere. So many of my clients know the locations of all their friends, their partner, and then they know their
Right.
location. And so that is something that we have been seeing a lot more of. And then, if someone stops sharing their location, it can cause problems, with their partner. And so just kind of being familiar with what that looks like, and how it looks different for teens, I think is something that we're continuing to learn more every day. And then, unfortunately, a lot of our youth, when they do, break up, separate from a partner, we're seeing like really high rates of like revenge porn, posting, nude
Well,
photos, sharing those with others. And so, we've been trying to educate ourselves more on that and help them, figure out, okay, how can I set up security? How can I address these issues ahead of time and try to prevent some of the fallout that could happen, unfortunately? So we're
well,
just seeing, unfortunately, a lot of online spaces utilized against young people and those relationships.
I'm so glad you spoke to that. Sammy, anything you wanted to be sure to say?
I guess, well, to put a little plug in, Kristen and her colleague, Dan, are going to actually both be coming to our February court advocacy roundtable that we're going to have. It's next Thursday. So, any of you court advocates who are working within the community doing your program stuff, you can come and have a conversation with us. We're going to talk specifically about qualified minors and doing court advocacy for teenagers. It's going to be, as you can tell, fantastic conversation with some people who are incredibly knowledgeable, and you can ask them all of your questions in real time. So we really hope that you guys can join us for that as well.
Yeah. And one last thing. We my program also recognizes that like our work with qualified minors is unique. Like not a lot of people in the state are doing what we're doing. And so, we'll talk more about this in the roundtable discussion, but we really want to be a resource too. So if people have questions or they just want to like talk through what that could look like at their organization, like please reach out to us. You can reach out to the coalition. They can absolutely, share my information with you. And we just want to be a resource for the state because we know this is not going away. It's qualified minors are going to continue to pop up, so we want to help places feel comfortable with addressing it.
Well, Kristen and Sammy, thank you so much for joining the conversation today. As I said before, you brought up some really important points that I think are really helpful when it comes to providing services to young people. So thanks so much. And listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We certainly appreciate it and look forward to seeing you next month on a new episode of Momentum for Change. Thank you for joining us. This has been a recorded conversation now available in both video and podcast formats. A video recording of this episode is available on the MOCADSV YouTube channel under the Momentum for Change playlist. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to receive new episodes in your YouTube feed. You can also find all of our Momentum for Change episodes available to stream on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. Momentum for Change is a podcast produced by MOCADSV with post-production support provided by Tim Stillings and promotion by Adrian Maddox. Again, I am your host, Nora Mosby, and we appreciate you joining us for this episode. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next month.